Hello, welcome to this Architecture Today webinar on new perspectives in healthcare design. Healthcare is a subject which has been at the forefront of all our minds, unfortunately, in the last year or so. But it does mean that a lot of the new and original thinking has actually either been put into practice or become of greater importance. So I think this is going to be a fascinating session for us. But before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to hand over to Sean Butler, who is Commercial Director of Schüco UK, who is the programme partner.
Welcome to the latest in our series of 80 Schüco webinars. In today's webinar, we will look at the opportunities for architects to improve our healthcare building stock as part of the government's plan to build 40 hospitals by 2030. The 3.7 billion hospital building plan involves the development of new measures to help standardise hospital design and make better use of modular construction methods to accelerate build. Our three expert speakers will take us beyond the basic plan to present different approaches to the design and adaptation of healthcare buildings based on unique research and current insights into the environments that enhance and help the patient experience. At Schüco, we believe that society has developed a new understanding of health. It's no longer just the opposite of illness, but represents a life in balance. This means creating safe and healthy environments wherever people work or live. This is doubly true within our healthcare facilities, where patients and the staff that work there need to be offered visual, thermal, hygienic, and acoustic comfort in equal measure. I think today's discussion will raise many crucial and relevant issues for all those interested in building the healthcare facilities appropriate for the needs of today's and future generations. Thank you once again for joining us. I'll now pass you to Ruth, who's chairing today's event.
Thank you very much, Sean. I will introduce our speakers in a moment, but before I do, I'll just tell you a little bit about the format of this presentation. So we are going to have three presentations. After each of the presentations, there will be a brief question and answer session. And then at the end, all our speakers are going to come back and we will have a panel discussion. So please, if you do have questions, do send them in as early as possible, and we will address as many of them as we possibly can. Now, I'm just delighted to introduce such a good panel of speakers. We will be hearing from two people from medical architecture, founder Christopher Shaw and director Lianne Knotts. We will also be hearing from Charlotte Rubin, who is a partner at White Architecture and who can give us a perspective on working in Sweden as well as in the UK. But first of all, we have Sophie Crocker, who is an architect and health researcher at HKS. Sophie.
What I'm sharing with you today is part of an ongoing project which began with the Flex report released in 2019 and was developed further with the Flex Contagion Special Edition and the Flex Hospital Surge Scenario last year. This year we'll be adding to it with our upcoming release, the Flex Hospital, a cost-benefit analysis. Today I am representing a wider team, including my HKS colleagues on the project, Paul Sawyers, Dan Flower and Raphael Petrovich, as well as our partners for the cost-benefit analysis, Mark MacDonald. So why do we need flexibility in our health facilities? I'll be looking at two aspects, the need for long-term and short-term flexibility. This pie chart shows the relative age profiles of hospital estates in NHS England. As you can see, only around 20% of estates are 15 years old or younger. Meanwhile, over a third of buildings comprising hospital estates in NHS England are over 45 years old. When we think of the dramatic developments in medical technology and healthcare outcomes in the last decades, it seems hard to imagine that a hospital that was built that long ago can still function well. Buildings are built to last, and we all certainly hope that hospitals we design and build today will be useful and functional in half a century or more's time. But we know that there will be significant development and evolution in medical treatment, healthcare service provision, as well as demographic and population health needs in that time. We need to be designing buildings that not only service our needs today, but are capable of evolving with our needs in the future. This is tricky. and it's made trickier by the lengthy procurement processes. The needs of a facility are defined at outline business case stage, and it can take as long as a decade to get to occupation. Changes are common during the process, during briefing and design, as well as construction, not to mention the needs for change during the lifetime of a facility. Finally, long-term flexibility should be considered part of a sustainable development strategy, as buildings that are redundant in only a matter of a couple of decades will not be positively contributing to our challenge. Buildings that can flex and adapt will provide a more efficient use of resources in the long term. We should remember that the most sustainable building is the one that isn't actually built, and therefore the more we can design for future use and future functionality, the better. We also need to be able to flex and adapt in the short term, however. As of February, 4.7 million patients in England are waiting for surgeries. We need our hospitals to be able to offer pandemic-related care and to continue to offer regular healthcare provision. In order to cope with the numbers of patients needing general acute and critical care beds due to COVID-19, 80 to 85% of elective procedures and surgeries were cancelled during the peak of the first wave of the pandemic in the UK. Although elective provisions did start to slowly return in June, beginning with oncology and mental health services, the backlog is, as I already said, in the millions, and the latest surge has only added to this. In addition, attendances to the accident and emergency department fell to almost 50% of their 5-year average in April, and continues to be well below normal levels for the time of year. The reasons for this are not fully known. It is likely to be a combination of people staying away from hospitals for fear of a hospital-acquired COVID infection, for not wanting to overwhelm the health service that they know is already under strain, and due to the dramatic reduction in road traffic and other activities that commonly generate visits to the emergency room. For example, public transport use in London and on the National Rail dropped to as low as 4% of the national historic equivalent use, and car use dropped to as low as 22%. While the number of deaths above the normal rate during the first wave were mostly attributed to COVID-19, there is a not insignificant number of deaths above the normal rate not attributed to COVID-19. This could be due to ways that we were recording COVID-19 deaths, but it could also be a result of that reduction in A&E attendance that I just mentioned. This is also only looking at the months during and immediately following the first wave of COVID-19 in the UK. We cannot yet predict how the effects of not attending A&E, along with delayed treatments and diagnoses, will impact population health in the months and years to come. According to the World Health Organization, COVID-19 will not be the world's last health emergency, and there is an urgent need for sustainable health emergency preparedness to deal with the next one. We don't yet know how much was spent last year trying to adapt our inflexible healthcare environments to be able to cope with the surge in demand during this pandemic, but it would have been a lot less expensive if our facilities were built to flex in the short term. In order for our facilities to meet all our needs in the future, we must plan for these unfortunately likely future scenarios. Designing for short-term flexibility will allow facilities to continue regular care provision whilst also providing pandemic or other surge-related care and not having to make that choice again. So how do we go about designing for long and short-term flex? We use the Flex framework, which was developed in the original Flex study and further evolved in the Flex Contagion report released in 2020. There are 4 modes of flex: versatility, modifiability, convertibility, and scalability. These are listed here in a scale of the easiest to the most difficult to achieve, and this roughly marries with the least to most expensive. Increasingly, briefs are including flexibility and adaptability in their requirements. However, we need to define what we mean by these terms to ensure that we are all having the correct conversations with our clients and supporting their needs and strategies for future adaptability. If a client says adaptability and they mean, I want to do different things in the same space, what they're asking for in our terms is versatility. If a client asks for flexibility and what they mean is, at a later date, I want this space to change into another function, we define that as asking for convertibility. If we can codify the language, we can have more effective conversations and make sure we are providing the right strategies for future use. We considered how these modes of flex need to operate in the long-term lifetime shifts and the short-term surges. And initially, we added a fifth element to the framework, flow, as a consideration of air, resource, and people flow are critical circuit breakers in a pandemic situation. The typical flex framework is intended to function sequentially over the lifetime of a facility, using the modes of versatility and modifiability in the first 5 to 10 years of a facility's occupation, requiring minimal changes to partitions, space plan, layout, and then only leveraging the modes of convertibility and scalability in later years. During a surge scenario, however, all modes may well have to take place simultaneously, rapidly, and temporarily. These modes of flex will need to take place throughout all layers of the building, while the structure, skin, services, and space plan are designed and evaluated to ensure that they allow flex to happen across all layers. In addition to the flex framework, we use the flex hospital principles, which were developed for the flexible hospital prototype. The flex principles are based in these building layers, and they are design principles that act as enabling groundwork for future flexibility in the short and the long term. In the structure, we have the regular grid, which must be adhered to very rigidly throughout the building. In skin, we propose using a prefabricated and modular facade without interdependent layering. Meanwhile, the space plan must include soft space and expansion space from the beginning. I'll now go into these in a bit more detail. The structure underpins how the other layers of the building are formed and informs everything from the height of the space to the planning. Strictly adhering to a regular grid will negate any need for transfer structures, making space planning on every floor easier, and it will also result in some accommodation being larger than briefed. We do believe, however, that this will be more versatile in the long run, as soft space and expansion space will be provided from the start, and room types are not shrink-wrapped to the brief, but allowed to swell to have more versatility. In following this rigidly, the building will be able to accommodate not only the original program, but a range of other functions or a modified program. A key point regarding the structure is to ensure that the facility strictly adheres to a grid that is sized such that different clinical modules can fit into it, multiples of it or segments of it. Here we have examples of an inpatient pair of rooms, a trio of outpatient clinic rooms, portion of an MRI suite, and a couple of general operating theatres, all fitting into the same grid. The skin or facade of the building requires consideration to accommodate future flex. A static and monolithic facade will not be able to easily respond to conversions of space within a building or changes to the scale of a building. For example, a conversion may require a window where there was none. A modular prefabricated facade is therefore the most appropriate system. This method can also reduce the length of a construction program and contribute to meeting net zero targets. Avoiding interdependent layering will allow the facade to be more easily reconfigured or removed if required. And finally, ideally, the facade modules will be reused and redistributed on the building and not discarded after change or conversion. These are two HKS precedents of a prefabricated facade system. The Parkland Outpatient Clinic building in Dallas, which realized a 70% time saving on the wall system installation. Meanwhile, the Dell Seaton Medical Center in Austin achieved a 40% time saving on the exterior construction program, as well as $2 million construction cost saving. The mechanical, electrical, and plumbing services design is a critical success factor in the Flex Hospital. In order to accommodate both short and long-term flexibility in operations, these services must be easy to access, maintain, reroute, and upgrade, as well as having additional capacity built in from the start. Locating the service sizes and vertical circulation cores at the perimeter of the building has two key aims: to prevent the needs of the space plan competing for space with the risers, and therefore ensuring that they can be sized most effectively, and also allowing greater access for maintenance with minimal disruption to ongoing activities in the building. Service voids will also be standardized by their level of intensity, low, medium, or high tech. This will allow easier conversion of space into different uses with similarly low, medium, or high MEP requirements. It is important to note that in our proposal, we are not suggesting infinite capabilities of flexibility. We are not, for example, suggesting that an administrative office space should be able to flex into an operating theatre. That would be too far, and we don't believe that that would be cost effective. What we do believe is that additional space, for example, extra space on an imaging suite floor, should already have the loading requirements built in from the start, so that if adjacent space is required, that additional strengthening is not needed later at a later date, and the service voids will already be able to cope with the MEP. The space plan strategy is broadly dictated by the flex principles applied to structure and services. These principles are intended to allow ease of conversion and adaptation over time. Soft space is built in within the departmental boundaries, allowing preliminary expansion to occur without eating into other departments' areas. Here we have the example of an operating theatre suite, where there's soft space built in between the general operating theatres, which can at a later date be expanded into to form specialist theatres or hybrid theatres. This will mean minimal impact on the rest of the department and not having to eat into areas of adjacent departments. The space plan is also where the need for the short-term flex and pandemic preparedness happens. As well as considering potential future functions, designers must look at the ability to split the facility into different zones, vertical and horizontal, as well as directional flows and protective thresholds. You can find out more about this in the surge scenario report that we released last year, but I won't be going into that in detail right now. The Flex Hospital uses these principles to create building modules, which can be arranged as the program and site requires. This prototype was based on an urban condition, but it is important to understand that we do not think of this as a one-size-fits-all approach. We know that a suburban and rural setting would have a different massing and different approach. And we also understand that not every estate has the luxury of a clear site, but more commonly must extend, retrofit, and adapt piecemeal. We strongly believe, however, that applying these principles as far as possible to every project, no matter how big or small, will reap rewards from design through to construction. A final point to mention in the development of the Flex Hospital is the concept of anchor and tenant departments. Anchor departments, which are here in the red, are ones which are seen as critical to a hospital and highly unlikely to completely leave in the coming decades. These are departments such as operating theatres, accident and emergency, and the NICU. Tenant departments, here in the blue-grey colour, are ones which house functions which may well either be relocated into a community setting, a virtual setting, or even be centralised off-site, such as laundry and CSSD. The space left by the tenants can then make room for either a department expansion, indicated here in the light red, or alternative programs, which could even be revenue generating, such as life science startup, lab and office space, or retail. So what have we done with all of this? We took a recently designed NHS General Acute Hospital and anonymized it, providing us with a base case scenario. Using the same program, we modeled a flex prototype, following the flex principles, such as strictly following a regular grid and pulling the service risers and vertical circulation cores to the perimeter of the building. We found this generated a small increase in overall gross floor area as departments swelled to fill the grid and as we regularized department shapes to make fire compartments more efficient. In addition to the program swelling to fill the grid, we took the decision to standardize and increase the width of corridors from 2.4 meters to 2.7 meters. We believe this move will allow maintenance to occur with limited impact on circulation, remove pinch points and passing points to improve operational efficiency, as well as improve bed evacuation during a fire. We decided to retain a full interstitial plant floor as well to ensure that there was sufficient capacity for future needs. And we believe this will also have the added benefit of reducing horizontal duct runs, create one fire compartment for the plant floor, and reduce disruption during future maintenance and upgrades. So to recap, just some of the benefits that come with the Flex strategy above and beyond ease of future change. It provides ease of access for maintenance, reduces disruption during maintenance and upgrades, improves operational efficiencies, and improves fire evacuation, rationalizes fire compartments, reduces the chances of staff areas being compromised during planning, and enables 100% standardized rooms without variation, which assists in reducing design and construction program lengths. In the coming weeks, we will be releasing the new report, which covers much of what I've discussed today, but additionally, it will include the cost-benefit analysis of designing for flexibility. We costed the CapEx of the base case and the flex prototype, and then we're calculating comparative cost for change for different change scenarios over a 30-year period of the building's lifespan, as well as factoring in potential revenue streams. We're really excited about this piece of work and can't wait to share it with you soon. We believe this piece of work is critical to demonstrating the value of investing in flexibility. We understand that it will likely mean an increase in upfront costs as service provision and area increases slightly, but the return on investment along with operational benefits listed earlier should more than compensate. In a time of significant spending on the NHS's built environment, it is imperative that this investment of public money reaps the maximum benefit for the maximum length of time. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Sophie. That was fascinating. And I think perhaps of all the things that you said, I was most gripped by that idea that if we don't get our terminology right, we could all find ourselves talking about different things. We've had some questions come in, great questions. I'm going to address some of them now, but I just remind everybody that as well as these questions after each speaker, and do keep sending them, we will have a panel discussion at the end. So if you suddenly think, oh, I should have asked that, you still have an opportunity. Not surprisingly, we're getting questions about COVID. There's a couple of questions here. One is, the key flaw in current hospital designs is you cannot open the windows to purge viral load locally. The issue is connections between inside and outside. And somebody else has said, aerosol spread is the top transmission pathway. Is it sensible to sell pandemic-proof design without mentioning planning for natural ventilation?
Yes, those are good questions. But we do feel that in a hospital environment, the mechanical ventilation can play a big role in this. You just have to make sure that the systems are designed such that you're not recycling air, that you have filters appropriately leveled when needed, and perhaps it might be a case of additional units so that you're not sharing, AHUs across multiple wards or multiple rooms. So that's some of the uplift in MEP spec that we're expecting, is to try and counteract that. We don't see it as being a requirement to have natural ventilation in all cases to achieve these improved rates of air purification, I guess.
Thank you. Now, somebody else picked up on the fact that you had several examples from America, and they're asking, does the flex approach better suit private healthcare buildings?
That is another great question. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to implement this yet in the UK. As I mentioned in the front end of the talk, the procurement process is somewhat challenging when it comes to really having an uplift in spec to have future-proofed design and have that return on investment over a longer period of time. I think we are all aware of the challenges of the way and who is paying for each part of an NHS facility, whether that's the CapEx or the operations. But we're confident that in talking about this, we're going to get that conversation going and make people realise that it is worth spending, and hopefully also enable the government to invest more. We actually have a facility in the States right now that is implementing some of these principles, and so we're really excited to see how that turns out, and they are costing it as well at the moment. So that's a live facility. We didn't reference that right now because that is a little bit sensitive, but it is going to be coming out soon. So yes and no, I guess, is the answer. We're hopeful, but
you're hopeful, okay.
I think yes.
Yeah. Because I'm also getting questions about people's mental health needs as well as their physical health needs. I know that we are going to be addressing some of this directly later, but there is that feeling coming through in questions that you have to make sure that you don't just heal people's bodies, but that you put them in an environment which will be good for their sense of well-being. I think we'll take that rather than talking about mental health facilities particularly. But how much are you looking at the healing environment instead of just mending bodies?
I mean, it's always a layer that's added onto our designs. It's not something that's ever excluded. But our, I guess our focus in this is just to make sure that the function is there and the long-term function is there. When you're starting to look at the healing environments, for example, views to nature, ensuring there's sort of a use of biophilic design, noise and light all kind of contribute to that. That starts to be folded in, I think, in the later stages of the design. The principles I was talking about today, a lot of them structure, MEP, these are some of the things you don't even see. So we're confident that it is a healing environment can be layered in to the flex principles and would certainly not be sort of unconsidered or excluded from that.
Thanks very much. As I said, we'll look forward to seeing you again at the end for our panel discussion. So if anybody has any questions for Charlotte, not for Charlotte, for Sophie, sorry, do send them in because we will still have the chance to address them. The reason I said Charlotte is because I'm about to introduce our next speaker, Charlotte Rubin, who is an architect and partner at White Architecture. And she will be giving us, to a great extent, a Swedish perspective. So over to you, Charlotte.
During the last decade, huge investments are being done in Sweden in new healthcare facilities for the same reasons as now in UK, with technically outdated building that does not always support new ways of working within the hospital or in the large healthcare setting. Each project is unique, and it is not possible to define general conclusion on future healthcare design. And I'm happy to be here today to share some reflections from two projects that I have engaged me in the last years, from competition to completion, the NKS project and the O-House project at Karolinska University Hospital. Both projects represent a high future agenda that was already set back in the early 2000s, even though pandemic was never mentioned. After many years of planning and construction, they were commissioned before the outbreak of COVID-19 last year. Karolinska University Hospital is one hospital on two sites. There is Solna in the north, the location of the 330,000 square meter brand new facility that was commissioned in May 2018. And we have Huddinge in the south with 400,000 square meter hospital from 1970 plus 30,000 square meter extension in the O-House. The university hospital plays, of course, a key role during the demanding situation of pandemic on a clinical but also on a research level. Karolinska was recently ranked as the 7th best hospital in the world. COVID-19 has, of course, engaged the healthcare design network all over the world. Between May 2020 and February this year, the European Healthcare Property Network, Rumble Water Project, and White arranged a series of webinars where several case studies presented action from different healthcare systems, how they responded to the urgent need of intensive care units. So we are in a steep learning curve, but the lessons learned so far point out the need for temporary solutions, flexible and adaptable facilities, the separation of flows, smart logistic concept for goods and material, and last but not least important, healthy and healing environments. Nobody knows today what the effect the pandemic will have, how healthcare will be delivered when society goes back to normal. This uncertainty about the future creates a stress in itself. Is this the new normal? And this puts even more demands on today's topic, according sustainable healthcare design and the importance of adaptable and motivating environments during a prolonged pandemic. Also, how daylight views, art and interior design makes a difference to promote health in the long run. Both projects has been designed with a very high level of flexibility. In Solna, our task was to redesign last spring and rebuild the ECMO department from single patient room to an open floor solution in 4 months. And in Huddinge, the brand new operating theaters, 23 of them, were transformed to 64 intensive care units only in 10 days. Back to the New Karolinska, the NKS project. It is a part of a new urban development in the center of Stockholm, where the principal design is based on proximity, a generic and adaptable structure with clear divisions between acute and elective care, high level of separation of flows with a multiple external entrance possibility, but one main entrance. The general ward plan consists of single patient rooms located in 5 core buildings, supported by automatic logistic solutions, elevators in between core buildings, flooding in daylight, overlooking the surrounding. The objectives for the refurbishment of the ECMO department was to improve staff collaboration with better visual control of each patient from one centrally located workstation. The challenge was to rebuild with ongoing activities next door. This demand task was technically possible due to some built-in parameters within the structure, as the double corridor system, the decentralized shafts with redundancy in the technical installation, but also for the facade systems. This image is from 2012 when it was up under construction, where you can also see how the floor plan had a standard for the bearing capacity. Also, how the decentralized shaft enabled the separation within the department. And this flexible floor area of 2,000 square meter is designed to be adapted for different use over time. So NKS is really planned and built to be rebuilt without disturbing the adjacent floors. From technical issues versus the human needs, the high expectation on architecture and design was already defined in the design competition 2006, with an open and generous public entrance floor. Today it is of course restricted for visitors, but nevertheless the 6,000 staff that is working within this environment need complementation, and destruction might be even more important in the prolonged pandemic we now experience, with an option to take excursions in a relaxed and non-clinical environment with views, daylight and outdoor access to parks or balconies. It is no rocket science, just common sense that could easily be forgotten in the complexity of planning, delivering healthcare projects. Let's go to Huddinge project. The building consists of 29,000 square meter extension of the existing hospital, it's a high-tech environment where new medical devices support new way of working with high demands on logistics and safety. Except technically advanced clinical planning, our challenge was to create a human environment that promotes health for both patients, but specifically, I would say, for the staff, where all the operating theaters are located along facades with daylight, and the corridors, staircases were also located with views over the park, and the color and material concept that supported wayfinding and orientation. The project also included a landscape design with an outdoor gym. And the exterior was also developed with respect for the existing architecture from the 1970s, with one exception, to bring in the light. So this is the operation floor plan with design principle, as you see from the New Karolinska presentation, with a double corridor system, staircases and elevators and corridors with daylight. Also a strategic location of shafts, and very important, the sufficient floor-to-floor height. The building was ready for commissioning in March 2020, just before the outbreak of COVID-19. So in 10 days, the 23 operating theaters were transformed to 65 intensive care units, with all medical devices needed for intensive care. It was, of course, a huge challenge from all engagements. And the double theater unit, as you see here, was then transformed to 3 patient intensive care units that was overlooked from the preparation room. Also, you had the hand wash behind the preparation room, so this became quite a hygienic, staff and patient-friendly solution during tough circumstances. So, and also the future-proofed objectives were kind of tested from start about adaptability. As seen here, the positions of the ceiling-mounted equipment for operating procedures were possible to adapt for intensive care, and the passing through cabinets created a smart logistic solution for goods in a clean environment, flooding in daylight. So again, the essence of distraction, feel-good environment has never been more urgent in healthcare design. To increase working conditions for the staff, I would underline. Qualities as details of a wood railing or a courtyard with art installation. Who could ever imagine a Venetian crystal chandelier in an operating department? It is unexpected, it creates distraction, affinity, and simply joy. To summarize, every project is unique, and we are in a steep learning curve with healthcare design, from master planning to the design of details. And the lessons learned so far from these 2 case studies could be summarized in these following bullets to be considered in early stages to achieve a future-proofed agenda. Number 1 is the culture of change, to change the way of working. And that requires proximity to enhance collaboration in a flexible and adaptable environment, that also affects the urban integration with the location of entrances. And last but not least important, again, in attractive indoor environments. During the past decade, White has been involved in delivering many new healthcare buildings all over Scandinavia with different types of needs. But what they have in common is our values to develop sustainable and motivating environments to promote health and well-being. Some of them with higher demands on flexibility, others less. We are now happy to bring forward our lessons learned from Scandinavia. Currently in the UK, we are engaged in schemes for the new Cambridge Children's Hospital together with Hawkinson Brown. And last week we presented with MBBJ our proposal for the new Children and Maternity Hospital in Leeds. And within a couple of weeks, we are delivering our last delivery for the new Moorfields Eye Hospital, which is a result of a competition that we won 2019 with ACOM and Pinoy Prasad, where our scope is to develop the public realm, including interior and landscape, where this beautiful roof terrace will be the breakout area for staff recreation. So I round off my presentation here and look forward to take this discussion further in the panel. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. Those were some lovely schemes to see. I've had a question, and I think it's particularly relevant because obviously we are trying to understand Swedish practice. What was the effect on the build costs of making the spaces you designed so much more flexible for the future?
We did some early calculations for the new Karolinska project back in 2000, where we considered that the extra cost for flexibility would be around 5% or so. which was discussed in that stage, but was also considered to be a valuable investment. And the pandemic kind of proves that this extra cost for flexibility that I mentioned, with redundancy and possibility to expand and change, has been of great value during this past year.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Also, somebody's asked about, you mentioned collaboration and design, and they've said, when is the right moment, do you think, to engage with all the stakeholders?
Good question. When we have the same hospital with Karolinska University Hospital, but we have worked with projects on 2 sites. One was a new environment that was developed from scratch, where the reference groups were more representing knowledge than rather the final tendon for each department, which did cause challenges when commissioning. At Huddinge, we had the stakeholder engagement right from start, and we worked very, very closely with the end user during the process. So they actually became ambassadors for the built result from start. But that was a smaller project, and it was also a more developed during a more limited time. So the people that were engaged from start were actually the one that is now working in the environment. And of course, that is preferred, but there's not a simple answer on this one. It depends on the size of the project and how the process will be arranged around that.
Thank you. Also, you've shown us some wonderful spaces, particularly spaces, where you've thought a lot about the staff and their working conditions. And on the one hand, we're seeing places where people can look out of windows, but you've also created, roof terraces and things which look absolutely lovely. But my question is, certainly in the UK, and I really don't know anything about Swedish health practices, but we read so much about doctors and other medical staff who are having to work so hard that they can hardly, take a break to have a sip of water or whatever. I'm just wondering whether it's realistic, because I'm wondering whether they're actually able to use those spaces under the time pressures that they suffer.
If the attractive spaces are there, and if your need for a break is strong, I am convinced that they will be used, but maybe it's hard to say how. But if they are not there from the beginning, they will of course not be used. But
Yes,
the possibilities are there. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I just say to everybody again, if you've got more questions that they occur to you now, or they've just occurred to you, do send them in, because after our final session, we will first of all take questions for our last speakers, and then we will go into a panel discussion. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our final session of this webinar, which is a 2-headed session. We've got Christopher Shaw and Lianne Knotts from Medical Architecture.
New models for healthcare design. This is our presentation for the Architecture Today Schüco series. Medical Architecture is the company that you're seeing at the moment, and you're going to be presenting. You've got myself, Mr. Shaw on the left-hand side, and Lianne on the right-hand side. Just a little background on medical architecture, because it really is what the name is. We've been around for 30 years. We've got offices in London, where I'm based, and Newcastle, where Lianne's based. We work rather unusually only in healthcare design. We're very, very specialised, focused on health. The work we do is plenty in the UK, but also worldwide. Fair bit of work in North America, Middle East, historically quite a lot in Australia. The firm, compared with most architects, I think our work and our engagement is probably earlier in the process and also later in the process than conventional architectural design, in that we get involved in the development of the planning around business cases, very strategic work at one end. At the other end, we are involved in lots of post-occupancy evaluation, and I'll be touching on some of that as we go through this. And also because we are highly specialised, we've been involved in most of the UK building standards and guidance over the years. But I think the thing to remember is we are an RIBA charter practice. We are a firm of architects and operate conventionally in that sense. When looking at healthcare, particularly in the UK, there are a number of challenges which sort of drive the new models and the changes that we're seeing. First point, I think, which is fairly obvious, is that we've got a very ageing building stock. The infrastructure in the UK is, on the whole, quite old. We've underinvested historically. Even at the peak of the PFI era, we were just touching the sort of norms that other countries would see. And it is a lot of money. It's 8% of gross domestic product goes through health in the UK. A little bit lower than that at the moment, but and other countries in Europe are probably a bit higher than that, and in the United States an awful lot higher than that in terms of GDP. Big challenges, as I touched on, in backlog maintenance in the NHS in England were around £9 billion backlog to catch up on. That's not to say that all of that needs to be spent to bring it up to the current status. You'd want to change and adapt and perhaps have new types of buildings. Low carbon is a challenge. There are a number of initiatives around the NHS and nationally, and in fact internationally, as we see today, for reducing the carbon dependency in the infrastructure. And as I say, the challenges around new types. There are changes in health systems which require new types of health infrastructure. And really, those main challenges are certainly at both ends. We've got the big acute hospitals, which I'll touch on. We've got increasing focus on maintaining care at home. And then we've got what I've described as rethinking the middle bit, mental health care, which Lianne's going to talk a little bit about, and then the idea of consolidating community services in a new kind of hub. And I'll touch a little bit on those as we go through. So handing over to Lianne, are you ready to pick up?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in designing for mental health. Personally, it's something I've been involved in for around 14 years now, and a sector for really where demand for services is increasing, even more so over the last year during the COVID-19 pandemic. Traditionally, there has been underinvestment in the mental health sector, with hundreds of beds across the UK still in dormitory style accommodation, which really has been quite a scandal during this pandemic. However, on the upside, we are starting to see a large volume of investment, and I'll briefly share a couple of projects with you where some of that investment has taken place that we've been involved with over the last couple of years. So before that, I think it's worth talking a little bit about what the words therapeutic environment mean to us. Within the mental health sector, it's crucial that the environment plays an important role in promoting wellbeing and recovery. We know the benefit that access to daylight and views can help with our circadian rhythm, and how good acoustics, especially within a building, can help calm us. Things like this are really extremely important for a patient who is mentally unwell. The role outside space can play in allowing access to nature and how that affects our well-being, whether we're mentally ill or not, is again something that has been crucially highlighted during this pandemic. Access to gardens or other outdoor space has allowed us to take our daily walk easily and meet our friends again, now restrictions are easing. However, for people within a mental health inpatient unit, there is a reliance on well-designed courtyards or gardens to provide this amenity. I'll touch now on a recent project at St Anne's in London. This is an inpatient facility for adults who are acutely mentally unwell and or may have an eating disorder. The existing building was not designed for this purpose, and it was clear that the physical environment was having a detrimental impact on quality of care and staff retention. A routine inspection by the Care Quality Commission noted that the current wards were some of the worst in the country, and the project offered the opportunity to consolidate a underutilised site as well as providing new mental health inpatient accommodation, as the building is located in a predominantly residential area. So the new Blossom Court, our brief was to provide 74 new beds in a 2-storey building, as well as master plan the whole site for the future. It is sustainable, having achieved a sustainability BREEAM score of excellent, which can often be very difficult to achieve in mental health buildings due to the complexity of detailing required often to suit the complex patient groups. Blossom Court on the diagram there is the pair of buildings you see at the upper part of the sketch. And that building really paves the way for the remaining hospital buildings to be re-provided to complete the whole master plan over the coming years. The building is important in that the site is open to the public now, and the building has become part of the urban grain since its opening last year. The previous building was contained behind high walls and fences, so Blossom Court really is destigmatising mental health care in the community. The secure enclosure is created by the building itself, with the use of large, high-performance windows, removing the need for security fences that are typically associated traditionally with mental health accommodation. This means there is little visually to remind a patient of their reduced freedom of movement and helps announce the building to its surroundings in a public way. Safe but immediate access to outside is provided by courtyard gardens at ground level and large safe terraces at the upper floor. For some mentally unwell people, there is a need for secure forensic accommodation, especially for those who have committed an offence. This provides a safe environment and a place that is dignified, encourages recovery, and helps build trust in social interaction and personal autonomy. Northgate Hospital in Northumberland is one of the first of the government's new hospitals programme. It's currently on site and will provide 74 beds across 6 wards. As you can see from the model there, these are arranged around a large external landscape courtyard. And like at Blossom Court, the building perimeter provides the secure enclosure with views from the external perimeter looking directly into the unique and beautiful woodland setting of the existing hospital site. The design concept for this project was the idea of village campus, and the central courtyard provides the village green. We know that traditionally mental health inpatient settings can be very, very boring places to reside, with little opportunity for variety across the day. We also know that boredom in these settings often leads to very challenging behaviours and poor physical health. We developed the theme of a meaningful day to ensure that every patient space offers the opportunity for varied activity, whether exercise in a person's bedroom, shelter from the elements on a rainy day outside, or the opportunity to complete a 5K run within the courtyard, which can be seen on the image there. I don't have much time to go into further detail here, but within the mental health sector, there are a number of specialist services which are poorly supported with lack of investment and fit for purpose accommodation. Thankfully, NHS England have recently announced 26 new hubs for perinatal services to support women who've recently given birth, but overall the opportunities to improve the patient environment for many specialist sectors has been difficult. We know that for all of them, the importance of nature and access to dedicated outdoor space cannot be underestimated. So before I hand back to Chris, I hope I've been able to demonstrate briefly how the quality of place plays a big part in the recovery of people who are mentally unwell. We know that our buildings have a big part to play in challenging the stigma that still surrounds many of these facilities, and how the environments within these play such an important role in balancing stress levels and leading to recovery and a better quality of life overall. Chris, over to you.
Right, thanks, Lianne. I'm going to just touch a little bit then on some of the other areas that I mentioned in the introduction. Acute hospitals, I think everybody thinks of healthcare, they think of acute hospitals. Surprisingly, it's not a very old typology. The current public hospital really dates back about 200 years, but it's very fixed in the public imagination, and the focus of the new hospitals programme, capital investment, can be seen as sort of very politically aware from the government side. There's a sense in all communities that they need a hospital as the focus, and certainly the investment is long overdue. As Lianne said, we're involved in a number of the new hospital programme projects. This one on the right hand side large-scale new hospital in North Manchester with Shepherd Robson Architects. But the role of the acute hospital is changing. Larger hospitals are getting larger. There's focus on serving much larger populations, partly because of the pressure on academic training, the consolidation of equipment, expensive equipment, but also the specialisms are becoming more specialised. So what you generally see, with example here, the Great North Specialist Care Hospital, which is part of the RBI in Newcastle, is that this brings together a whole lot of critical care and specialisms in a new unit, serving a fairly wide population area, well beyond the typical district general hospital area. And those integrate with much wider systems. When everyone thinks of changes in health infrastructure, health buildings, it's really around changes in the health system and support for those. I'm going to touch on a number of areas that are the impetus for changes that we're seeing at the moment, and many of you in the audience will be aware that sustainability is changing everything. The climate change emergency and so on changes the way that we think about not only the buildings, not only the fabric, the logistics, the food systems, the transport associated with hospital. A typical general hospital will have 15 to 20,000 trips a day going to and from, or certainly the larger ones would. So the location of the hospital and the relationship between the hospital and the community, the population it serves, is generally very important in terms of its sustainability. So here we can see, the hospital integrated with the city as a quarter within that city and central to the planning, the self-image of the city and the population that it serves. COVID-19 has affected all of us, and particularly in the UK and in Sweden to a certain extent, the impact of quite low bed capacities with reduced bed numbers very significantly has been a bit of a wake-up call. So there is significant pressure to increase the number of ICU, intensive care beds, and respiratory beds, and also to have to improve plans around surge capacity, where those very big numbers of people presenting at once. And then sort of touch on the triumphant return of Florence Nightingale's principles around ventilation, with airborne virus being the problem that we have here. And that's a major challenge, not only for architects in terms of space planning, but also for engineers in terms of the way that they look at engineering systems. The impact of digital on hospital design, I think, is probably underexplored at the moment, in that traditional hospital is largely organised around historic departments, movement of paper, materials and logistics, and the impact of new communication systems, I think, has a very significant and emerging impact. So part of that is entirely new pathways, such as genomics and genomic personalised medicine, which is making a big difference in cancer care at the moment. The impact of algorithmic diagnosis and complex diagnosis, I think, is just coming up fairly rapidly, and that will change the way that, for example, outpatients departments are considered entirely. And it will change to a certain extent the relationships within the health system. And finally, remote consultation and monitoring. I think one of the big wins, I suppose, out of the pandemic has been the very rapid move to remote consultation and diagnostics, and that has made a very big impact on hospitals, and it's not going to go away. It will be retained. There are some things that are a bit peculiar to the UK. So the increasing demand for emergency services and the use of emergency services as a first port of call for a large proportion of the population means that what were quite small parts of hospitals are now becoming very, very important, and in fact whole hospitals in themselves in some areas. So we're seeing ways of mitigating this huge demand in many ways. So the 111 service, which is telephone triage. The impact of primary care streaming, so bringing what would have been bumps and scratches to your local GP, bringing that into the process. And of course, there is an increasing demand around trauma. And kind of associated with that, a large part of the demand on emergency services comes from the increasingly frail and elderly population we have. And so we're seeing the emergence of integrated care, which is the new sort of strand of healthcare, where moving from the model that a hospital typically has, which is episodic diagnosis, treatment, repair, and you're out, to integrated care, which is the idea of a sort of continuing care for people who have chronic and continuing illnesses to provide a better quality of life. And that's linked with home care and so on. And a new generation of primary care, primary community care centres we're seeing in terms of the Cabell centres. The building on the right-hand side, the Jean Bishop Integrated Care Centre in Hull, very proud of it as a building, serves half the population of Hull, so a very large population, and it provides a base for a whole lot of complex and continuing diagnosis, and manages and supports a large population and links well with the GPs. So these new classes of health infrastructure supporting wellbeing at home, virtual wards, increased remote monitoring, kind of air traffic control for health, are just starting to emerge. And repurposing the existing estates, such as we're doing here at Whitby, I think is central to making that work, providing new linkages between primary, community and acute care services. You can't avoid, in any discussion about health, the quality of housing. It's a good base to turn to, and we really do need to see shifts in the planning system and in the quality of housing stock to lead towards healthier types of cities. And finally, particularly in England, we need to shift to what I've called social care at scale, which is the sort of care home, rehabilitation, recovery kind of environment, which hasn't really been invested in significantly at all, but will have a very major impact in the future for this population, for this kind of architecture. So I'm just going to wind up there. Thanks very much for listening to us, and look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. I got two phrases from that, which I love. One is the one about the resurgence of Florence Nightingale, and the other was air traffic control for health. We've got some questions coming in, and I think my first question is definitely going to be for Lianne, which is about as mental health facilities grow larger, how do you feel about roof terraces? I know you mentioned them, but the concern is that if you use roof terraces in mental health facilities, you're going to be putting up big walls to protect people.
Thanks, Ruth. Good question. I think, as you said, any opportunity for access to outdoor space is paramount, wherever that is. I think we do have to work within the level of security that we're designing to. So when I mentioned about the different sectors within the kind of mental health sector, I suppose, you obviously do have different classifications of levels of security and that kind of thing. So at Blossom Court, we did have terraces at first floor level, and obviously they had to be protected at the boundary, but they were kind of within the overall building boundary, I suppose, so they weren't viewed from the street. As I say, I think any access to outside space is good. It just needs to be balanced with the level of safety and security. And if we can do that at ground floor level, then obviously that takes that away.
Thank you. And I think this one's for Christopher. It says, you talked about making hospitals much larger, having these really big hub hospitals. And at the same time, you talked about having access to them, making them part of the city, because obviously you don't then want everyone having to drive. Can you tell us how do you think the land is available to do this? Do we have the place to build these mega hospitals?
The NHS has a vast amount of land in England. It may not all be in the right place, and we do need to work with the existing large hospitals in Nottingham and Leicester and so on, these large cities that have these big estates and reconfigure them over time. I think it is a challenge if you're considering something like the Karolinska being inserted into a large existing city. That would require years of foresight and planning to do.
Mm-hmm.
But we shouldn't exclude the possibility of it. I think that it's a combination of these. I think that the reuse of the estate plays very significantly into sustainability. We've got a lot there that we can reuse. But new types of hospitals will require an entirely different kind of environment. So the adaptation is likely to be quite severe.
I think we've lost you for a moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the opportunity to go on to the next part of our program, which is that we're going to have a discussion with everybody here as a panel. And I think the first thing that might be really interesting to discuss, and let's see who wants to go first, is the whole question of repurposing aging building stock. We've touched on this, but I think it's a really important question. I mean, presumably, if we are going to have, on the one hand, these really large hub hospitals, that means that there are going to be fewer of the sort of existing middle-sized hospitals. Can those buildings be repurposed into the sort of community facilities that we want, or are we going to be stuck with a lot of buildings which, as we've discussed, are really rather old and not fit for purpose? I think I'm going to put that question to Charlotte first, because I think it might be interesting having a perspective that at part comes from another country.
Responsibility for the primary healthcare to actually support the new healthcare systems, and but of course they are more fragile buildings. They don't have the same floor-to-floor height as the new technical equipment requires. But as more low-tech supporting environments, they have great potentials, and needs to be a part of the regional planning to see how they could support in the overall system.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Sophie now, because I think, you've shown us a very prescriptive model of hospital design, for very good reasons. And I understand where you're coming from with it. But it does raise the question of how you can integrate any of this thinking into existing building stock.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a challenge. And we also are aware that, as I said in the talk, that this luxury of green space to build brand new big facilities is a rare one. But therefore, we do think it's still important to consider these when you're looking at your existing facilities. Are you extending them or renovating the interior? It might be that you can only try and plan to the grid that you already have. So then are you looking to make sure you have that sort of increased capacity in your MEP systems that we talked about? Perhaps you're going to reclad the facility or parts of it, partly to increase its sustainability, but also then looking at the facade modules that you're going to be selecting, making sure that you can sort of prepare for any additional changes coming in the future, and not think in the short term in that respect. So we understand that it is a challenge, and actually we're most excited about trying these out on an existing building, because we do like a challenge, and that's where we'd like to really get our teeth in and see what we can do. But yeah, I think it's about choosing which ones work in which situation, and just understanding that it's not a case of all or nothing. It's a case of thinking of it holistically and trying to achieve what we can. I mean, the government's Modern Methods of Construction working group has set out sort of principles and guidelines and aims for the public construction. So this is also, sort of working into that. If we can start setting out these regular grids, setting out these principles, it makes all of that a lot easier, and that improves construction time, safety on site, efficiencies, sustainability. It's I know it sounds prescriptive, but I do believe that there's still a lot of room for beautiful design within that, and we just need to make sure that we're doing the best we can for the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I've got a number of questions here, which I think in a way relate to each other. I've got one which I'm going to certainly put to Lianne first, which is, with all these changes and improvements that we're looking at and better design for mental health care, etc., do we expect care homes to respond and to be designed differently? Perhaps I'll give you that as a question straight away, and then I'll move on to some of the others, Lianne.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I think, again, I think relating back to the pandemic this year and kind of how the care sector, again, like the mental health sector, has become quite a forgotten sector, I suppose. We've seen some terrible images on the news of what care home residents and care home staff have gone through, and I think there is a need for change, and how we can respond better to similar crises in the future, I suppose. So yeah, I think again there's opportunities within that sector to improve environments and again, access to outdoor space. We saw pictures on the news of care home residents kind of looking out of the window, not being able to go for a walk outside because of the level of risk. And I think there's certainly things that we can do as architects to improve those sectors for all.
Thank you. And I think another thing which possibly is relevant to this, I mean, you've talked a lot, and I think it's terrifically important about access to outdoor space and being able to get outside. But, with the best will in the world, we're not going to spend all our time outside. And somebody's asked the question, soft furnishings and finishes play a major part in mental health and well-being. How involved do you as architects, and I don't think this is just a question for you, Lianne, how involved do you get involved with interior design?
Yeah,
I will ask it to you first.
Yeah, yes. It's very important and a big part of what we do. And I think you can't talk about providing a therapeutic environment if you don't start with the inside out, I suppose. So, and again, we work ourselves with the client groups, kind of. Again, it's all to make sure everything's tested through infection control, and we know what we need and what we can use. And I think that goes back to my point I made about acoustics, that soft furnishings are part of doing that, part of improving acoustics within these environments, which can be very clinical and have very hard surfaces. And again, how we can, every part of the building needs to respond to that and improve the environment. But yeah, it's certainly a very key part of what we do.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know if others have got a view on that. Charlotte, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, we see this, the agenda is so much more than only the healing environment agenda. So I think as an architect, you have to work with the design concept for the project from the early stage all the way. You cannot only say that the things as the interior design comes later in the process. You have to bring all these aspects along from start. And that's the same with all projects. It doesn't, healthcare projects doesn't stick out. And now with the sustainability agenda, which might be even the most important one, I think also that these issues about the green agenda has so many other benefits on the footprint of the project in itself, how to handle the day water and greenery and to see it from a holistic view and to make a sustainable design from many points of views.
And Sophie, I mean, you've talked a lot about the sort of modularity of your design, about the cladding, etc. Does your model and do the hospitals that you have built in America, do those really look at as well at the internal environment?
Yes, absolutely. As I said, we always consider the full environment, not just the structure. In London, we actually have several specialist healthcare interior designers as well. So although our architects may well be contributing to that design, we also have a team of dedicated interior designers which as Charlotte said, it's important to get that contribution from the very early days of a project. And because we have them in our team from the start, we're able to do that from the very concept. And I think, as you said, it all folds into how do you make the building sustainable, safe, beautiful, therapeutic. It's not just one thing we're trying to achieve. It's very complicated, but therefore it's also extremely interesting. And I think some of the buildings that are beautiful in healthcare are kind of more exceptional for that.
Thank you. We've got a question here about saying super hospitals versus community care seem to completely conflict. So which is the right strategy for the future? I'm not sure they do conflict. I think they may well actually complement each other. But I think one of the things I'm really interested in is, I mean, when I talked to architects about healthcare a few years ago, it was all about reducing the number of beds in hospitals, getting people out into the community. And, we all know that there's that idea now that you should spend as little time in hospital as possible. And therefore, one would expect beds to go down as an overall strategy. Then, of course, we have the pandemic. And, Christopher, I'm going to come to you in a minute. There's this talk about needing more beds. I just wonder kind of where we're going. There seem to be all sorts of conflicts and flip-flops, which is very interesting when, on the one hand, again, we've all been talking about flexibility. On the other hand, budgets, however much we decide to spend, are always going to be tight. So I just wonder if you'd like to talk around that subject, Christopher.
Thanks, Ruth. Yes, so it's very, I mean, conflict is implicit in the system. And I think that it's worth realizing or recognizing that the physical environment is only one part of it. I mean, the biggest challenges to any health system, particularly in Europe, is workforce at the moment, and we need to think about how we do that. I don't think there is a conflict between the larger hospitals becoming larger and a different model of community care happening more locally. The best place to get well is not in a hospital at all, is at home if you possibly can. And I think that the new classes of infrastructure that we're starting to see are around managing care well at home and managing your wellness as best as we can through virtual wards and so on. But there is this sort of intermediate state, which I think we've when we look at Germany, for example, in Germany they have a lot of beds, but they have far more recovery rehabilitation beds than most other European countries. And I think we need to look at that again. And Lianne touched on the care home sector. In England in particular, it's pretty dysfunctional. We've seen the Southern Cross collapse, and we've seen others. Most care homes are quite small. They're 24 beds, I think, is the sort of the average. And I think that when one looks at the Netherlands, Finland, and so on, you can see that much larger, really thinking in a much larger scale, without necessarily becoming institutional, is a future for that kind of thing. And maybe that repurposing hospitals, which the smaller local hospitals, into a different kind of environment that doesn't pretend that it's going to do trauma or the higher end of acute care, but maybe focuses on rehabilitation, recovery, and quality of life. Maybe that is a future that we can consider. There's often quite a lot of resistance from within any health system to change, but there are lots of pressures that are forcing us that way.
No, it's a really interesting and complex issue, isn't it? And I think another one which has come up in questions, and obviously is the really big question. We've talked about flexibility. We've talked about having a little bit of excess capacity. We've seen in the pandemic, particularly in the case of the Swedish hospitals, how quickly that can provide a benefit in terms of being able to reorder things. I mean, I think that everyone's saying there will be more pandemics, but on the other hand, there's a sort of let's cross our fingers and see if we can skate through this attitude. And the real question is, how do you justify what will be additional capital expenditure now in order to provide not only better facilities and more flexible facilities in the future, but actually to save money in the future in spaces you can repurpose? It's money spent now to save in the future, and that's often very, very difficult to argue on government priorities, isn't it? I know none of you are politicians and none of you are making those decisions, but you are in a great position to make the arguments to the decision makers, and I wonder how you would set about doing that. I don't know who'd like to go first. Shall I come back to you, Christopher, because you said you work at the very early stages of projects, maybe not early enough.
To be honest, I don't think there's a great deal of resistance to spending more for flexibility and adaptability, but I think the case needs to be made in terms of long-term value. And that, the strength of a case for long-term value is around efficiency and certainly the adaptability, the ability to change, but also the more effective use of workforce, which is by far the more expensive revenue item in terms of a health system. So we as architects need to think far more about those revenue costs of an environment rather than focusing as we do on the really nice rendering, the getting the building built, the really well organized technical detail, and I think we need to get into longer term simulation modeling of the kind of environments that we're producing, and that I think will really bolster the business case for more capital, and I think that's an area that we as a profession really need to expand into.
So that's interesting, and I'm going to put it to one of the others now, but is that a matter of, I'll come to you, Sophie, is it a matter of looking very carefully at the design so that, from one nursing station you can see more beds? Or how have you looked at the efficient deployment of staff and the amount of time maybe that they spend walking around? I don't know where that efficiency comes, remembering that you are dealing with people and not cyborgs as your staff.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's not been a significant part of the scope for this project, but there are multiple studies that HKS have contributed to, as well as others are out in the field that we use when we're designing facilities that look at staff movement and staff efficiencies, trying to reduce any errors as well in terms of medicine administration. And things like that. One of the things that we do is what we'd call a design diagnostic. So if there's an existing facility, you can study the movements of staff and patients in a ward or an outpatient clinic, and you can look for where maybe the log jams are, or where the unusually long distances to walk from A to B are. And then in the new facility, you can address those issues, and you can try and reduce those problems, and you're also looking at how many steps, how many miles does a nurse walk on a shift, and try and reduce that, because not only does that save her time or him time, it also will mean that they're not as tired at the end of the day, that they're able to focus more, and that they'll come to work the next day in a better place to serve their patients. So yes, it's absolutely making efficient layouts is absolutely part of what we want to do to make sure that staff are able to deliver the best care. Looking after staff is really important, and actually that's one thing that we hope is a positive of the flex design, is that by not shrinking all the areas to this sort of to the SAQ, it's just going to allow us to give that staff space a bit more and not have it cut when you've got cost-cutting exercises happening, because unfortunately those are considered sometimes extra, and even if they're requested at the outset, they do start to get shrinked when there's a limit to how much you can cut an inpatient room or a clinic exam room or an operating theatre, but unfortunately there isn't so much of a limit to how much you can cut a staff rest area. So yes, we're hopeful that this will contribute to that as well, which all folds into looking after our people.
And your hospitals your flex hospitals that you've designed so far have been in America, and you're now wanting to do this in the UK as well. And I wonder how much difference you see in the culture of how the healthcare system works, and how much impact you think that will have on design.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of differences, and there's not partly the staff, partly the administration, but also partly the patient. In the US, it's sort of a bit more of a consumer, sort of environment. Here, if you're going to the NHS, you perhaps don't consider yourself a consumer, and therefore perhaps you have some sort of, I don't want to say lower expectations, but you accept things that perhaps an American consumer wouldn't, which isn't right. And therefore, I don't think it should mean that we start to, reduce standards. But I do think it means that there's different priorities from these patient groups and from, therefore, the operators of the facilities in terms of what they're aiming to achieve and what they're aiming to provide. We want to provide the best possible standard of care, free upfront, and ensure that everyone is treated equally and fairly, and that you're not going to have to wait a long time. One of the big things of this pandemic is that we now have extremely long waiting lists. We already had backlogs, but it's just going to keep getting worse. And I think that all folds into making the flex principles in terms of allowing that regular operation to happen in the future. Just to go back to that earlier point in terms of why should you invest in this? Pandemics, yes, I think more will happen more frequently, but also, there's going to be major climate events happening more frequently. What happens if there's a town that's flooded and then there's an overflow of, surge in cases needing to go to the local hospital? This is not just about pandemics, it's about surge in a variety of situations. And so I do think it's looking at the situation holistically and looking at the challenges we're going to be faced with in the next 50 to 100 years and focusing on that.
Thank you. And I'm going to put the cultural question to Charlotte as well, because obviously you've come from your vast experience of designing in Sweden, and now you have been designing in the UK as well. And I'm just interested to see how you think those different healthcare cultures affect what you're being asked to design and how it works.
From my point of view, I can see that in Sweden, we bring along a lot of competences really early, not at least the technical competences, the engineers and the mechanicals. So when the projects that has been the most successful, I think, is when you work as a team for holistic solutions already in early stages. As these two examples I presented, you can see how the importance of location of shafts and staircases, etc., how they actually affect how you will experience the building in the long run. And those stages we have to define very, very early in the master planning or even in the first stages. But so I think maybe we have a more holistic way of working, that we bring along all these aspects parallel from start. But I also feel positive that the awareness of the human agenda in healthcare design is raising now increasingly fast. And I think this webinar is a great example of that also, with 500 listeners, or I think it is. So, but my advice is when we have successful project, the design concept is set early, and they follow along all the way, and they become like a contract within the process that is equally important as all the clinical streams or all the technical streams or all the shell and core streams that is running parallel. You have to have the heart of the project must be the design strategy from early stage until it is delivered. And the representatives in these work streams must also be dedicated and believe that these things matters, that they are important, and that is a part of the interest of the heart of the driving force in the project.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's probably a good place to call this pull this together to an end. I hope all of you watching have enjoyed it as much as I have. I found it fascinating, and I'm sure you have, because we've seen those questions come in, all the ones we've had time to answer and a few we haven't, and people saying how much they've enjoyed the presentations as well. So really, it only remains for me to thank you all for watching. There will be an opportunity to watch again. Thank all our speakers for their really in-depth research and their fantastic presentations. Thank our programme partner, Schüco, and on behalf of Architecture Today, just a big thank you. Goodbye, and I hope to see you all again soon at another event.